Concorde. The very word still evokes an image of a time when British aviation technology soared above all others. 20 of the great birds were built and carried many thousands across the Atlantic in great comfort and at great speed. It was also a very safe aircraft, with only one fatal flight in its 27 years of service. The joint Anglo-French aircraft also heralded in a new era of cooperation that would lead to Britain joining the European Union. But the most important contribution Concorde made was to keep the British aircraft industry alive during the tough post-war era. Concorde may not fly today, but its legacy lives on in an industry that was near collapse in the 1960s. Ironically, the origins of Concorde go back decades, to a time when Britain still ruled much of the world. Nearly 50 years before Concorde flew on its inaugural flight in 1969, the world's first daily international flight service began between London and Paris on the 25th of August 1919 with great fanfare. The flight, flown by an airline that evolved into British Airways, took 2.5 hours and cost £21. But carrying only 2 people, the flights were of limited use. Ironically, it would be a German aircraft builder, Dr. Claudius Dornier, who would design an aircraft that in many ways would be similar to Concorde. He started designing the Dornier DOX flying boat in 1924, and it was finally launched on the 12th of July 1929. It was a remarkable aeroplane, and by far the largest passenger aircraft built up to that point. It was powered by 12 engines, 6 tractor props and 6 pushers. It was built to fly 66 passengers across the Atlantic, with a crew numbering between 10 and 14 people. It was the epitome of luxury, with seats that converted into sleeping berths for the passengers, a full kitchen, a wet bar and a smoking room. After a series of test flights where various problems were worked out, it finally arrived in New York on the 27th of August 1931, to crowds filled with wild enthusiasm. At last, there was something to take their minds off the horrors of the Great Depression. But it was the Depression that kept the DOX from entering production, and it never saw commercial service. Still, it was a great motivator for other aircraft builders, and in the United States, various companies started building similar aircraft. The first of these to fly, in 1934, was the Sikorsky S-40, designed for Pan American Airways. It would soon be known as the Flying Clipper and the Pan Am Clipper. Here it is being tested above San Francisco Bay on America's west coast. In October 1936, the first Pan Am Trans-Pacific passenger service started. It would finally introduce luxurious flying on a regular basis, thus fulfilling the dream that had begun with Dornier. But it would be Hitler and the Third Reich that would ultimately lay the groundwork for Concorde. After coming into office, Hitler assumed more than a position of power, he became like a god to the German people. They saw him as a way out of despondency and despair. Having lost World War I, Germans were dismayed. They wondered why Germany and Austria had been defeated. Among others, communists, socialists and Jews were blamed. Moderate German Democrats were criticized for having agreed to the armistice of November 1918, and the myth arose that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back. In late 1918 and early 1919, near anarchy reigned in Germany. The armistice had taken effect, but there was violence on the streets. The Kaiser had abdicated and there was a power vacuum. Fighting was widespread as communist groups tried to take over. They were opposed by the Free Corps, groups of ex-soldiers. They were able to prevent a communist takeover, but then tried to take power themselves. Their coup attempt failed, and the German government managed to just stay in control. But in the eyes of many Germans, their so-called Weimar Republic had little legitimacy. It was into this volatile mix that Hitler emerged to lead the Nazi Party. At first, the Nazis were an insignificant political force based in Munich. But slowly, Hitler imposed his own twisted view of the world on the party through sheer willpower. He mastered the art of public speaking. Though not a natural orator, he practiced and refined his technique to the point where he could rouse an audience to near hysteria. Hitler spent the mid-1920s building up his party. He and his henchmen found various social groups that heeded their message. But their real opportunity came when the world economy went into freefall after the Wall Street crash of 1929. In the subsequent Great Depression, Hitler's message blaming communists, socialists and Jews for Germany's problems found a more receptive audience. As the streets of German cities descended into violence, with Hitler's brown shirts attacking communist agitators, many confused and dispirited Germans saw the Nazi Party as a bulwark against the forces of international revolution. The Nazis did well in the elections of 1930, becoming Germany's second largest party in parliament. In 1932, Hitler challenged the elderly but still well-respected President Paul von Hindenburg in his re-election bid. Although Hitler lost that challenge, it set the stage for another parliamentary election, from which the Nazis emerged as Germany's largest political party. Hitler refused to share power with any other group, and his gamble paid off when he was made Chancellor in January 1933. Now in government, but with a minority of seats in Parliament, Hitler cleverly used events to take over absolute power. On the 27th of February 1933, the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, caught fire. A mentally deranged Dutch communist was caught and confessed to the crime. President Hindenburg was persuaded to suspend some civil liberties. And in an election in March during which the Nazis whipped up emotions to a fever pitch and intimidated opponents, the party received over 40% of the popular vote. With a working majority, the Nazis voted to give Hitler greatly increased powers as Chancellor on the 23rd of March 1933. This gave him the basis on which he set out to control all aspects of German life. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died and Hitler proclaimed himself president, becoming head of state as well as head of government. He was now known as the leader, the Führer. Once secure in power, Hitler's policies of rearmament, ignoring the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, and an inspired finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht, enabled the country to pull out of the economic depression. Unemployment was down to a mere 300,000 by 1939. Industrialists and bosses did well. The middle classes were relieved that there was now order and stability. Workers were equally pleased. They not only had real money in their pockets, but innovations such as subsidized holidays and improved standards of living. Hitler funded a series of state-supported projects that had both popular appeal and military usefulness. It was the support for the aircraft industry that would have the greatest impact on history. German manufacturers designed and constructed aircraft far ahead of their time. The technology gained by this would be put to full use later on by the Luftwaffe. These new airliners looked like something out of the 1950s and 60s. The future of the German Luftwaffe was enhanced by the rapid expansion of German civil aviation. The Junkers Ju-90 was a perfect example. It was a 40-seat, 4-engine airliner developed for and used by Lufthansa. It was descended directly from the Ju-89, a contender in the Ural bomber program aimed at producing a long-range strategic bomber. This concept was abandoned by the Reich Aviation Ministry in April 1937 in favor of smaller, faster bombers. The Focke-Wulf 200 also served as an airliner, but would ultimately be used as a maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Still, it was the Ju-90 that proved how advanced German technology had become. The airliner could seat up to 40 passengers and had a range of over 700 miles. It could fly at 200 miles an hour at a height of over 18,000 feet. It had twin vertical stabilizers, giving it a unique appearance. The wings were built around 5 tubular girder spars, covered with a smooth, stressed skin. The leading edge was quite markedly swept, the trailing edge almost straight. The Junkers double wing, a full-span movable flap aileron combination was fitted. The tail unit used the traditional Junkers corrugated skin, the only part of the aircraft to do so. The fins and rudders, the latter with prominent horn balances assemblies, were placed at the end of the tailplane. This latter carried the elevators separated by a gap, forming another double wing. These components were also used in the Ju-89. The new fuselage was an oval cross-section, covered by stressed, smooth duralumin skin. On the first 4 Ju-90As, there were 5 pairs of rectangular windows on each side, each double pair lighting a divided-off section of the cabin containing 8 seats in facing pairs on either side of a central aisle. The Ju-90B adopted round fuselage portholes. It first flew on the 28th of August 1937 and entered passenger service with Lufthansa in July 1938. These planes were in many ways symbolic of the greatness that Germany could have achieved in the commercial world had Hitler not pursued his dream of conquering Europe. But at the time, before war had begun, they were a symbol of Germany's new hopes and dreams. But it would be the development of the jet engine in Germany that would make history. In 1936, a young engineer named Hans von Ohain had developed a jet engine, which the Heinkel company developed. It was tested strapped to a conventional fighter. It worked magnificently. Heinkel then built the H-1-178, the world's first jet aircraft. It made its first flight on the 27th of August 1939, just a few days before the Second World War broke out. it was a success. In the meantime, the British were also making advances. An RAF engineer named Frank Whittle had patented an idea for a jet engine in 1930. And in September 1939, the British Air Ministry ordered a prototype jet fighter to be built. The experimental E-2839, prototype for the Meteor jet fighter, first flew on the 15th of May 1941. Meanwhile, the Germans were surging ahead with their own fighter jet. The Heinkel 178 project was abandoned in favor of the Messerschmitt 262 Schwalbe, or Swallow. It was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. It was produced in World War II and saw action starting in 1944 as a multi-role fighter, bomber, reconnaissance, interceptor warplane for the Luftwaffe. The Me-262 had a negligible impact on the course of the war due to its late introduction, with 509 claimed Allied kills, although higher claims are sometimes made, against the loss of about 100 Me-262s. Because the Messerschmitt jet fighter allowed for a proper center of gravity through a slightly swept wing design, it had considerable fuel capacity for its two voracious BMW 003 engines and could handle well at low speeds. The Reich Air Ministry ordered 3 prototypes in July of 1940. It first flew on the 18th of July 1942, almost 9 months ahead of the British Meteor's first flight. The conventional gear of the Me-262 V3, forcing a tail-down attitude on the ground, caused its jet exhaust to deflect off the runway, with the wing's turbulence negating the effects of the elevators in the tail-down attitude, and the first attempt was cut short. On the second attempt, the test pilot solved the problem by tapping the aircraft's brakes at takeoff speed, lifting the horizontal tail above and out of the wing's turbulence. The 262 became operational in the spring of 1944 and engaged in combat for the first time on the 26th of July 1944. When one shot down an RAF Mosquito over Italy. It was the first victory for a turbojet fighter aircraft in aviation history. It had a top speed of 550 miles per hour with a range of 652 miles. It could remain airborne for 60 to 90 minutes. The 262 put immense pressure on the Allies to counter it with a jet of their own. Pressure was on to get the Meteor operational. Getting the engines to perform properly was perhaps the biggest challenge, but Whittle and his team worked incredibly hard to perfect them. Finally, the first 20 Meteors were delivered to the RAF on the 1st of June 1944. they were just in time to help counter the new threat to Britain, the German V-1 flying bomb. The first V-1 attack on Britain was on the 13th of June 1944. Ultimately, some 10,000 would be fired at England, 2,419 reaching London, killing 6,184 people and injuring almost 18,000. It was a grim moment for Londoners who had hoped there would never be another Blitz. But the Meteor proved to be a relatively effective defensive weapon against them. They shot down 13 V-1s in what was to be the first air combat between two jet-powered aircraft. The Meteor would stand as a symbol of the re-emergence of British aviation technology, surpassing that of even the Americans. With the collapse of the Third Reich, the Me-262s fell into Allied hands. More advanced even than the Meteor, the close examination of their engines would give the British information to build even more advanced jet aircraft very quickly. But it would take a bit of time for Britain to recover. The war had drained the economy, and the damage done to the industrial base was immense. Still, people rolled up their sleeves and got to work, putting the country back together. Fairly soon, the British were finally getting used to peace. There was not a lot of money, but once again, people went to the seaside on holiday and to relax, and began to think about the prospects for the future.
Blackpool opens her gates to southerners who are visiting the north. What a wonderful sight for landladies. They'll be doing a roaring trade if the weather keeps up the good work. Now let's get down to earth and see what the place has got to offer.
The Bristol Brabazon airliner was perhaps the most iconic symbol of that new optimism. Its design was based on plans to build a very large British bomber, which in the end never happened. In 1943, a government committee headed by Lord Brabazon called for developing a long-range passenger aircraft capable of serving the transatlantic market. Once the war was over, the bomber design emerged as a prototype in December 1948. Its 8 engines drove 8 counter-rotating propellers. It had a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour and a range of 5,500 miles, ideal for crossing the ocean. It was nearly the size of a 747, but was only configured to carry around 100 passengers in very luxurious conditions. The interior layout called for a forward area with 6 compartments, each for 6 passengers and a 7th for just 3. A midsection above the wing with 38 seats arranged around tables in groups of 4 with a pantry and galley, and a rear area with 23 seats in an aft-facing cinema with a cocktail bar and lounge. But this would soon be the Brabazon. The concept was a fusion of pre-war and post-war thinking, using highly advanced design and engineering to build an aircraft that was no longer required in the post-war world. The moment had arrived for large numbers of people flying, not just the rich and powerful. Still, it impressed many on its initial flights, which began on the 4th of September 1949. It soared through the skies, a symbol of new British hope and aspirations for prosperity in the post-war world.
Britain now celebrates another proud day for civil aviation. When all her trial flights are completed and the necessary adjustments are made, the Brabazon will lead the world as Queen of the Skies.
But its size and design failed to impress any airline, and ultimately none were ordered. Some £53 million had been spent on its development. The British government finally decided to cancel the project, and in October 1953, the one and only flying Brabazon airliner was broken up after only flying for 400 hours. Still, the investment made in the infrastructure at Bristol Aircraft's Filton factory was not wasted. The upgraded facilities would be ideal for building Concorde. The Brabazon was just the start of Britain's quest to fill the skies with British aircraft. But it was Britain's success with jet engines in the war that would really change things. After the Brabazon Committee approved the development of the Bristol Brabazon, they also approved a pure jet-powered aircraft. It would become known as the Comet. Its first flight was on the 27th of July, 1949. This aircraft would initially be a great hit. With its 4 jet engines, it could fly at 500 miles an hour, and it had a range of nearly 3,000 miles, carrying between 56 and 109 passengers. BOAC had ordered 10 aircraft. It was the first fully pressurized commercial jet aircraft. It was a huge hit as the early versions toured Europe. It entered regular passenger service on the 2nd of May 1952 with a flight to South Africa. But the Comet soon faced an uncertain future. In October 1952, it suffered its first crash. No one was killed, but soon 2 other Comets were involved in fatal accidents. But on January the 10th, 1954, Comet faced another catastrophe. This time, it was virtually doomed. The future of the Comet, the world's first passenger jet airliner, hung upon the outcome of a court of inquiry held at Church House in London. This is some of the evidence. Mr. Bishop, the man who was mainly responsible for designing the aircraft, attended. So did leading Air Ministry and civilian authorities. No Comet had flown with passengers since the 10th of January, because Yoke Peter, the Comet which smashed all records on a flight to Johannesburg several years earlier, crashed with a loss of 35 lives. Yoke Peter took off from Rome Airport on schedule. A few minutes later, the aircraft exploded. Ships of the Royal Navy hastened to the spot, but there were no survivors. Immediately, BOAC grounded all Comets, and the search began for the wreckage. Thus, the most extensive investigation of its kind ever held was started. Naval units under the command of Admiral Earl Mountbatten gave every assistance to salvage fragments from the seabed. The pieces of the aircraft were taken back to Britain, and slowly Yoke Peter was reconstructed. And although the wreckage was scattered over a wide area, 80% of the aeroplane was pieced together. Meanwhile, other exhaustive tests were being carried out at Farnborough. Another Comet, Yoke Uncle, was to be placed in a giant tank of water and tested until destroyed. Suitably ballasted, the aircraft was completely enclosed by the tank, which is about 112 feet long and 16 feet deep. 200,000 gallons of water were poured in. A further 100 gallons were forced into the fuselage to place a strain on it equivalent to that encountered in actual flight. The next step was to test the wings. Automatically controlled jacks moved them up and down. Yoke Uncle endured the test for the equivalent of 15,000 hours flying time. The water tank test finally caused a failure in the fuselage. A point of high stress at the corner of an escape hatch failed, and the wrench developed. This, the experts said, was the result of metal fatigue. Similar traces were found on the wreckage of Yoke Peter. BOAC had high hopes that the Comet would soon fly again, and that Comets 2 and 3 would begin their passenger flights around the world. Britain saluted the backroom boys who spared nothing to solve the Comet mystery, and to put the record-breaking airliner back in the forefront of modern aviation. The Comet resumed flying, but on the 6th of April 1954, another Comet crashed. This time, the British government withdrew all Comets from service. They would not return until 1958, but by then the Comet's moment had passed.
Announcing the departure of Flight 609, now loading at Gate 1. Flight 609, now loading at Gate 1. Have your tickets ready, please.
But it was America that drove the move to expand commercial flights. The post-war US economy, unlike that of Britain, had surged at the end of World War II. People were now flying everywhere and often. Airlines rapidly expanded their routes. From the late 1940s until the late 1950s, the Americans didn't worry about jet travel. The war had meant rapid developments in old-fashioned propeller airliners, such as the Douglas DC-4, which evolved into the DC-6. These were relatively fast and efficient aircraft. The Lockheed Constellation was perhaps the most iconic aircraft of the era.
Four of the latest compounded engines of 3,250 horsepower each. Do you realize how much power that is? Why, each engine has more power than a locomotive. This plane can fly up to around 400 miles an hour, and we are going to take a ride in it.
Since 1937, Lockheed had been working on the L-044 Excalibur, a four-engine pressurized airliner. In 1939, Trans World Airlines, with the encouragement of major stockholder Howard Hughes, requested a 40-passenger transcontinental airliner with a 3,500-mile range. Well beyond the capabilities of the Excalibur design, TWA's requirements led to the L-049 Constellation. With the onset of World War II, the TWA aircraft entering production were converted to an order for C-69 Constellation military transport aircraft, with 202 aircraft intended for the United States Army Air Force. After World War II, the Constellation soon came into its own as a popular, fast civilian airliner.
Ready to check mag. Number 1.
Aircraft already in production for the military as C-69 transporters were finished as civilian airliners, with TWA receiving the first on the 1st of October 1945. The first transatlantic proving flight departed from Washington, D.C. on December the 3rd, 1945, arriving in Paris on the 4th of December via Gander and Shannon. Trans World Airlines opened a post-war commercial intercontinental air service on February the 6th, 1946, with a New York to Paris flight in a Constellation. On the 17th of June 1947, Pan American World Airways opened the first ever regularly scheduled around-the-world service with their L749 Clipper America. The famous flight Pan Am 101 operated for over 40 years. As the first pressurized airliner in widespread use, the Constellation helped to usher in affordable and comfortable air travel. One of the reasons for the elegant appearance of the aircraft was the fuselage shape, a continuously variable profile with no two bulkheads the same shape. Unfortunately, this construction is very expensive and was replaced by the mostly tube shape of modern airliners. The tube is more resistant to pressurization changes and cheaper to build. But it was the advent of jet airliners, particularly the Boeing 707, that rendered the piston-engined Constellation obsolete. When the first 707 entered service, flown by Pan American, the whole world of commercial aviation changed. Pan Am was eager to introduce the public to its new flagship.
Sky over the Atlantic. The vast air ocean that must have stretched endlessly for Columbus when he sailed from Europe to America a few hundred years ago in over 2 long months. The same air ocean over the Atlantic probably did not seem as endless to Charles A. Lindbergh when he flew from New York to Paris some 30 years ago. But still, it took over 33 lonely hours. Today, that same Atlantic air ocean, leaving Columbus 2 months and Lindbergh's 33 hours in its wake, zooms by in a dramatic breakthrough. The year 1954 marked an historic event in the history of aviation. A new flight was inaugurated. It was called Flight 1000. There was nothing unusual about airport operations before Flight 1000's takeoff. It was duly announced and passengers checked in. Flight 1000's destination, London. Luggage was prepared for loading, and all other routine pre-flight activities were taking place. 1000 seemed to be just another flight to London, in all respects except that its passenger list was twice as large as on ordinary trips. Flight 1000 was airborne, but no plane was used. This was the first of so-called airline paper flights, a complete simulation of an actual flight that's been repeated more than 2,000 times since. The reason? To prepare for the revolution in transportation that is now here, the advent of commercial flying by jet clipper. In those early days, weather information for Flight 1000 and all the other paper jet flights was gathered as carefully as if real jets were to cross the Atlantic, gaining invaluable advance information about jet travel. For example, it is now known that at the altitudes at which jets cruise, generally 30 to 40,000 feet, flying will be above the weather. After years of paper flights like number 1000 and many hundreds of real flights with prototypes, the jet age is now here. The jet age begins before takeoff at the airline's new terminal, now under construction at Idlewild Airport, New York. Jets are parked around it, as in this model. Passengers will board by walking along a covered ramp directly to the cabin level. Ground transportation delivers travelers directly to check-in counters. The circular design of the terminal, along with its unique cantilever roof, will assure speed of service and convenience for passengers. This is it, the first American commercial jet capable of economical transatlantic service, the Boeing 707 Jet Clipper. First to go aboard, cargo and mail. Cargo shipments will be able to reach Europe in just 6.5 hours. A letter posted in London or Paris after the close of business may arrive in New York the same night and be waiting for the addressee at his breakfast table or office the next morning. Speed is a byword for every part of jet operations, since with some arrangements of seats, more than 150 passengers can be accommodated. There is an entrance at the back and the front, while plane servicing facilities are on the far side. One indication of the staggering impact of jet travel, every one of the airline's dozens of jet planes can carry as many people in a year's time as the biggest ocean liner. Last item aboard, the purser's briefcase, containing log, manifest, and other necessary documents. For the crew, ready to taxi to the runway now, fewer instruments than on propeller-driven craft, and engines that are so much easier to handle and maintain. The magnificent new jet, with a wing spread that's bigger than the entire distance of the Wright brothers' first flight. Takeoff, without any need for engine warm-up, with outside noise now reduced to no more than that of propeller-driven planes, capable of traveling at 575 miles per hour or more, much higher and faster than you've ever flown before. The first passenger jet clipper to fly the Atlantic. Because of its greater size and speed, it will do the job of several of the biggest propeller-driven planes. Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard the spacious cabin, attractively decorated, air-conditioned but draft-free. Newly designed individual overhead light units are an innovation. Roominess extends even to the powder rooms, which look like those in a private home. And a new sensation, complete absence of vibration. Near sonic speed, but inside one of the most stunning discoveries. There is no feeling of movement at all, no vibration, hardly any sound. A new concept in air transportation. The travail has been taken out of travel.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are now at cruising altitude, 35,000 feet. Our flying speed is 575 miles per hour. In addition, we're benefiting from a substantial tailwind by courtesy of the jet stream. Hence, our ground speed is now approximately 658 miles per hour. Indications are that our arrival at London Airport may be ahead of schedule. I'll be speaking with you again from time to time. Thank you.
This is the atmosphere on a jet clipper flight. Delicious food adds to the enjoyment. It's prepared in 4 simultaneously operating galleys where dishes can be cooked in 5-minute ovens. Scenes of living room quiet and relaxation. The mood enhanced by lighting that can be changed from the pale pink of dawn through all the variations to the dark blue of night.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. I've just been talking with flight control at London Airport. The temperature there is 64 degrees and the weather is clear. If you haven't already changed your watches to conform to the time difference, I suggest you do so now. We are now making our descent. I won't be speaking to you again, as we'll be in our landing pattern over London in the next few minutes. It was a pleasure to have you aboard our jet clipper. We hope to have you with us again soon. Thank you.
To London, in the same time that it takes you to go and see a baseball doubleheader. New York to London in 6.5 magic hours. It all goes so fast now, and it's so comfortable that you feel as if you hadn't traveled at all. Many hours gained and no sleep lost. London, the splendid ceremony called Trooping the Colour, celebrating the Queen's birthday. And you arrive not only with more time on hand, but also not travel fatigued. You can take in the scenes and events more fully and at a more leisurely pace. Only one of the remarkable gains made possible by jet flying. To Paris, 7 hours, only 30 minutes longer than to London. Paris, right away you're in the swim of things, because once more you've landed refreshed and with extra hours to do what you want to do in a leisurely way. Experiences like these, which used to be rare events for the few or the few thousand, are becoming neighborly visits for the millions, because international air traffic, already increased fivefold during the last 12 years, now undergoes its greatest change. Jet speeds will help to accomplish one of man's long-sought goals, an easy interchange of peoples throughout the world. Transoceanic flights now become short hops, 6.5 magic hours to Europe.
But back in Britain, during the late 1950s, people were still struggling to cope with an economy that was not racing ahead like the American one. Times were tough for a lot of people. But then slowly, things started getting better. London was rising out of the ashes of the devastation of the Blitz. In the early 1960s, a new wave of enthusiasm emerged. Things were changing very fast. Life was also becoming quite revealing.
The girls were submitting their forms in triplicate to show off the latest look in see-through swimwear.
People were stripping away all their problems with new and exciting holidays. The travel market began to lure people to beaches around the world. Cheap air travel was making a big difference. In places like Florida, the economy began to flourish, with travelers seeking a bit of naughty fun. Things were cheaper in the States, and in Miami in particular, a tiny bit sinful. Still, after a long day on the beach, it must have been quite nice to hit the nightlife offered to the new tourists from abroad. The new planes meant that airfares were cheaper than ever before. A whole new crowd could now afford to enjoy a little dirty dancing. But really, it was all in good fun. The bars wanted people to enjoy themselves and spend lavishly, and they did. The sights were well worth the price to be paid. The jet setters had arrived with a vengeance. The British at the moment were concentrating their efforts on nuclear bombers, the most important being the Avro Vulcan. This 4-engine subsonic strategic bomber would pave the way for Concorde. Its 4 Bristol Olympus engines would lead to the development of engines that could allow large aircraft to break the sound barrier. First flown in 1952, it did not enter regular RAF service until 1960. It was a remarkable aircraft. Its technology would lead to the Concorde. The Delta wing design would essentially be the basis of the Concorde prototype. The Vulcan was the first large bomber to have such a wing. Its range of nearly 4,000 miles was similar to that of Concorde. Although it was a subsonic aircraft, it flew nearly at the speed of sound, hitting 625 miles per hour, flying at a maximum altitude of 50,000 feet. It was a very agile aircraft, flying either very high or very close to the ground. Its primary mission was to carry nuclear bombs and serve as a deterrent to any Soviet aggression during the Cold War. Ironically, the Vulcan's only real combat role saw her hurling conventional bombs at Argentine positions during the Falklands War of 1982. 136 Vulcans were built, the last retired in March 1984. It was the BAC TSR2 tactical strike aircraft prototype that gave Concorde its chance. English Electric, manufacturer of the Canberra, and Vickers Armstrong had been judged to have made the best submission for the TSR2. The two companies combined their ideas for the specification and put forward their joint design with a view to an aircraft flying by 1963. No order was forthcoming, and by the time the ministry had made a decision, the various companies had been amalgamated as the British Aircraft Corporation in 1960. English Electric suggested a delta wing design, and Vickers a swept wing on a long fuselage. The English Electric wing, born of their greater supersonic experience, was chosen, while the Vickers fuselage was preferred. So, as in any good partnership, the aircraft would be built 50-50, Vickers the body half, English Electric the wings. The design was a large aircraft to be powered by 2 Bristol Siddeley Olympus afterburning turbojets, a variant of those used in the Avro Vulcan, which would later be developed further for Concorde. The design featured blown flaps across the entire trailing edge of the wing to achieve the short takeoff and landing requirement, something that later designs would achieve with the technically more complex swing wing approach. Roll control was by differential movement of the tailplanes. The aircraft featured some extremely sophisticated avionics for navigation and mission completion, far ahead of anything else available at the time, which would also prove to be one of the reasons for the spiraling costs of the project. Features such as ground-following terrain radar, FLIR cameras, side-looking airborne radar, and the sophisticated autopilot would only become commonplace on military aircraft later. The wing loading was high for its time, enabling the aircraft to fly at very high speed or low level with great stability, without being constantly upset by thermals and other ground-related weather phenomena. This in turn made the innovative ground-following radar and autopilot system feasible. To improve the ride quality at low levels, the cockpit was sprung or floated to help damp out turbulence and reduce crew fatigue. Despite the rising costs, 2 prototype aircraft were completed. Test pilot Roland Beaumont made the first flight on the 27th of September 1964. In the course of testing, the TSR2 was found to easily attain the demanding performance specification. Aerodynamically, the aircraft was trouble-free, but there were continual problems with the engines and the undercarriage. It seems the engines delivered for the first aircraft didn't fit, leading to delays in the first flight. That meant the TSR2 missed the opportunity to be displayed to the public at that year's Farnborough Air Show. The first supersonic test flight was achieved on the transfer from the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down to BAC Warton. Surprisingly, the aircraft achieved Mach 1 on dry power only. Following this, test pilot Roland Beaumont lit one of the afterburners only because of problems with the other engine's afterburner fuel pump. with the result that the aircraft accelerated away from the chase aeroplane, alighting despite the latter engaging full afterburner on both engines. A speed of Mach 1.2 was reached on that occasion. The TSR2 program only saw 3 aircraft built, and only one ever flew, but its engines drove it to supersonic speed. The British and French governments had agreed in November 1962 to develop a supersonic airliner, and the TSR2 engine allowed this to proceed quickly. While the TSR2 was cancelled, the technology that went into it gave the British Aircraft Corporation the knowledge it needed to proceed with Concorde. In February 1965, construction began on the British Concorde at BAC's Filton facility near Bristol. It would be a moment that the British would be very proud of and lead to a remarkable aircraft. But still, it would take a while for it to fly. Still, the newsreels of the era kept the public up to date with the fascinating new technology that would soon take to the skies. Greater and greater speed. It's in the blood of man. The Concorde, brightest star on the supersonic airline horizon, was the combined undertaking of Britain and France. British contributions were underway at Weybridge, Filton and Preston. Bristol Siddeley Olympus engines gave the Concorde close on 1,500 miles an hour. The all-important design of the fuselage was conceived to cope with double the speed of sound. A knitwear factory in Scotland was helping too. There they manufactured the fiberglass material to make the nose cone, which housed radar equipment. Metal would interfere with the signals detecting storm clouds. In Toulouse, France, chiefs of the great aircraft company Aviation held a press conference to report progress on the French part in the Concorde. This tremendous two-nation effort made the Concorde financially possible. Leaving nothing to chance, Aviation took one section of the fuselage for a test to destruction. The move had to be made at night when there was no traffic to impede the huge transporter. Now the whole world awaited the age of supersonic passenger flight to be inaugurated by the Anglo-French Concorde. Visiting the British Aircraft Corporation factory at Filton near Bristol, the Queen was to see for herself how the Anglo-French Concorde project was shaping up, to the delight of the crowd. During her tour, news came that increased costs for developing the 1,500-mile-an-hour jetliner had rocketed to an estimated £500 million. While Her Majesty was showing keen interest in the work, Parliament was expressing concern at the project's soaring expense. Much of Britain's hopes for a successful aircraft industry depended, as Prince Philip, who was a pilot himself, knew, on Concorde. The first prototype the Queen inspected, a mock-up, would first fly in 1969, but there was keen competition from an American rival. So, knowing how essential it was to keep the lead, both Britain and France poured more money into the project. But despite the alarming news of increased costs, Her Majesty's visit made it a memorable day for the people helping to build Concorde. The construction of the world's first supersonic airliner was nearly complete.